It's not a secret that Guam's territorial status is executed to the detriment of our people, but to the advantage of the federal government. I say it all the time on the show, pretty pretty unabashed, that I think that our Guam's territorial status is advantageous to the federal government, particularly in the ways that the island is utilized for military purposes. And so I think this is a good place for us to start. Based on Guam's political status and the way the existing relationship that we have with the federal government, how do you imagine utilizing this position as a non-voting representative for Guam to help advocate for Guam's issues, specifically around political status?
Well, thanks for the question. I want to just sort of throw it out there from the very beginning. I think that we put boxes around ourselves. And one of the things that I have really thought deeply about during this whole process of deciding to run for Congress, putting together my platform, talking to people all across the island, and listening to people all across this island, has been to look at different ways that we can achieve more for our people here on the island within the reality that we exist, right? Because growing up here my whole life, Guam is such a conundrum, right? We are U.S., but we're not. We talk about the mainland and we talk about the states and but at the same time we are, right? We sing the national anthem and we have, really patriotic veterans. And so it's that conundrum that is Guam. And you grow up in this environment and it makes perfect sense to you. But when you try to explain it to someone else, the conflicts between the things that we feel at the same time are something that really only can be understood by people here on Guam. And I think that we put too many boxes around ourselves. So I've been looking at the broad historical, record of how we got to where we are, and then looking specifically at today. So the first thing about today is, unlike the last 10, 20 years, we have an incredible moment in history, in global history, where Guam is at the center of really a global challenge, right? It's this whole clash between the United States and China. We're looking at the new Cold War, right? And in the center of that is Guam. So before we were strategically important to the military, strategically important to the U.S., but now, it's even more than that. We are strategically important for world peace, and I'm not overstating that. We really are. So what that does, in my mind, is it offers us an opportunity to say more, to ask for more, and not to ask for it because we feel like we were shortchanged. Not to ask for it in a way that, you're going to go to Congress, there's 540 other people there, and you can't tell them things that are anti-American because it's never going to make it through a body like that, right? So what we have to do is we have to figure out what things are in the American interests that would be able to promote Guam interests and the interests of the Guamanian and the Chamorro people to achieve some things that we have not been able to achieve yet within this new attention that we are getting, right? So as I look at that, I'm saying, first of all, stop thinking about the non-voting rep position as a barrier and look at what we can do in Washington with the freedom to be able to take what we have right now, amend it, change it, use it. So while we are pursuing self-determination for Guam, why are we acting like we can't do anything with our current status? We actually could do something with our current status. What are the interim amendments? What are the interim steps that we can get to engage in talks with the federal government to start to address policies that are hurting the people of Guam because of a military buildup? How can we start doing that at the same time that we're pursuing self-determination? I don't believe we need to wait until we achieve self-determination, because we all know that's going to be a long time and we don't have the time to waste. And so I say, while we've got this attention, that we throw off this idea of the limitations of unincorporated territory status. We throw off the limitations of non-voting status and we rewrite it, and we say, have our delegate in Washington not only employ strategies to garner the support of as many like-minded states for policies that would strengthen Guam in order to strengthen the American position in the Indo-Pacific. Because the stronger Guam's economy, the stronger our people, the more that we can show that we have environmental justice and social justice in America's piece in Asia, the better America is at conveying that to the rest of the world. So we leverage that, and then we look at the issues that have been dogging us for decades, and we try and attack it that way. So it's a different perspective, I think, that I want to take.
I definitely think that the militarization of Guam, the strategic, use of Guam in a global conflict, not just currently but historically, I think is obviously problematic for the people of Guam in the sense that it encourages this very clear sense of dependency. It's a forced dependency created for territories, specifically for our territory. And I definitely see how there's been this kind of clear history of just transactional relationship where we have tried to just figure out, okay, what do we have, what can we get, what is the kind of the best deal for Guam right now, how do we kind of take advantage of the situation. But I have to acknowledge that it's rare that we see it on kind of the other way. Like, we look at our relationship with the United States as one that is necessary to protect us from a global conflict. And I appreciate that you acknowledge that there's that Guam plays a role also in global peace, and it's really just the change in perspective. But that's also why I believe that Guam's attainment of a full measure of self-government is not just good for Guam and good for Micronesia, but it's good for the world. I think that the people of Guam and Micronesia understand acutely well the danger of a violent military threat. And, nobody here wants to see another, violent occupation or invasion. But I also think that fear is too often leveraged to our detriment. That fear is kind of pitted against, what we know is contrary to our value system in how we care for the land or how we have relationships with our environment. And so, I definitely feel like it's critical for Guam and the region to unify and to have a sense of solidarity in regard to regional and global peace. That said, I think it's a good segue into our relationship, our historical relationship and current relationship with the CNMI. As everybody knows, Guam and the CNMI are, ethnically one people, culturally one people, but politically divided, as a byproduct of colonization. I mean, it's pretty cut and dry. The CNMI was owned by a different colonizer, and we were possessed by another, and one decided to let go for a number of different reasons, and the other didn't.
Right.
And here we are. And, it's also very complex in the sense that the CNMI, Guam also had a very, robust push for Commonwealth. One attained Commonwealth and the other did not. I don't think that was an accident. I think that, Commonwealth for Guam was deliberately denied because of the way that Guam imagined itself as being self-governing. I mean, that was the ultimate crux of the failure of the draft Commonwealth Act for Guam, was that Guam didn't want to give up control of our own immigration. We didn't want to give up on mutual consent for military activities, and that was a deal breaker for Congress.
Right.
And so, I when I think about Guam at that stage, and that whole conflict, that whole fight went down in the halls of Congress. It didn't even get it to the floor. It died in committee, which is kind of salt in the wound.
Yeah.
But I do think it's important to recognize that Guam has always had these aspirations of political self-government, a full measure of self-government. Despite our political limitations, Guam has always attempted to be more self-governing than we actually are. Which is why I also agree that Guam should not we should not just put everything on pause until we get self-determination. I agree that there has to be work that is ongoing, but it can't be done in the kind of the light of like political status quo with improvements. I mean, I think that that's one of the most maddening things for even for me personally. I wasn't even around at that time, but there was a plebiscite at one point where one of the options was status quo with improvements.
I remember
And
that
nobody knew what those improvements were.
What was that?
You know, most people, and ironically, that was the lead vote getter.
Yeah.
You know, and I think it's understandable because I think most people assume that improvements just meant more resources for Guam. And I think it kind of goes with the saying, right? The devil you know is better than the devil you don't. And I think that a lot of people at that time couldn't imagine what Guam would be under a different status. And, you know, mind you, that was at a time when we didn't even know what a freely associated status looked like. Now we do, because we have neighbors in Micronesia who are now in the second round of their compact agreements, which I would argue that they've negotiated, you know, much better and much more comprehensively and, you know, thoughtfully than they did in the first round.
Yeah.
And it's no disrespect to, you know, anybody who negotiated the compacts in the first round, but that's just what experience does to you, right? You go through it, you kind of have your growing pains, and you understand the mistakes that you've made in the past. I think that Guam is on a very similar journey. I think that there's a lot of things that we've done really well in the halls of Congress. There's a lot of things that we haven't done so well. And so I think that that's a, you know, I think it's a good place for us to move. I mean, given our relationship with the CNMI and the similarities between us and the CNMI also has a non-voting representative in Congress, but in a lot of ways they are more self-governing. They have a higher level of self-governance than we do, in the sense that they're under a Commonwealth status.
Right.
How do you imagine Guam's delegate collaborating or working with the CNMI delegate in order to advance all of our collective issues?
So I've actually, you know, from the very beginning reached out, and I've got a dialogue started with both of the candidates from the CNMI. They're going to be having an election as well. Kilili Sablana is going to be stepping down,
Right.
which is going to be a big loss.
It is a huge loss.
He is absolutely one of the most effective territorial leaders that have been in Congress. And, you know, his ability to get 3 times per capita what Guam got for COVID relief
Right.
just sort of demonstrates his leadership and his leadership in the committees, and his knowledge and his understanding of how to advocate for the CNMI has really been something. So that'll be a big loss. But I've actually spoken to both of the folks that are running, Kim on the Republican side and Ed on the Democratic side, and I think there is really an understanding of an un Marianas approach that needs to be taken for a lot of different reasons, right? So let me walk you through a couple of thoughts that I have. So the first is, when you're looking at national strategy for the United States, which again, I link to global peace, right? And I'm not saying that casually. I absolutely mean that, right? When you look at it, it talks about America as a Pacific power. So the question becomes, how is America a Pacific power, right? It isn't San Diego that makes America
Right.
a Pacific power. It's not Hawaii. That's too small. It's not the Aleutian Islands. It really is the whole combination, right? And at the forefront of the Indo-Pacific, right there in the threat with North Korea and with China and Taiwan, it's Guam and the CNMI, right? We are on the front edge. So if you imagine in your mind America saying we are a Pacific power, and you drew out the map, we're on the front lines, right? And in terms of resources, in terms of, you know, how does the United States project itself into the Indo-Pacific region? It needs to not just be military, because if you look at China, right, they've got the full measure. They've got diplomatic efforts, economic efforts, and military efforts. They're doing all 3. And the United States is now rushing to catch up, right? So now all of a sudden there's this rush in the last 5 years. We've got to get more diplomatic engagement out there. We've got to get more economic engagement. That's where Guam is missing out, because they're just kind of skipping over. A lot of these efforts in the U.S. are skipping over Guam and the CNMI, and they're trying to strengthen the economic ties between allies in Asia and the United States. And I'm like, whoa, hey, hang on, wait a minute, right? We're going to be the center of military buildup. We also need to be partners in the economic buildup, right? And while we are looking at that, being able to leverage the strength of an economy that works for Guam and the CNMI is something that we've not been able to achieve, right? So while there's all this activity to put all these military bases on Guam, it works behind the fence, but all of the unintended consequences are actually becoming more and more evident outside the fence. And what we need to do as an island is we need to, along with the CNMI, take more time and more effort and make sure that the economic stability, the societal stability, and the environmental restoration that has to go on at the same time is accomplished while we're doing the military piece that we are a part of. Something that I think is also important is when we're trying to get change, when we're trying to achieve change, we have to be realistic, right? We're not going to be able to change things overnight. We have to, at some level, understand the playing cards that we were dealt with and have the best possible hand. And I think in order to do that, I think if we stopped looking at it as if you look at the Pacific, right, there's the U.S. influence in the Pacific. So it's all the colonial pieces that were Palau, the Federated States of Micronesia, the Marshalls, CNMI, and Guam, right? Then you've got the former British colonies of the Pacific, a lot of whom are independent now. And then you've got the French colonies on the bottom, who are clearly going through some major growing pains at the moment. Why is it, let's broaden the question, why is it that we're all still accepting in the year 2024 that former colonial powers were allowed to slice up the Pacific into 3 segments where it's impossible now to easily travel between Guam and American Samoa, 2 American territories, right? You don't have the trade routes, the transportation routes, the connection between all of the Pacific Islands. Guam, they just announced, we just got observer status in the Pacific Islands Forum, right? Why is it just observer status? The colonies in the French colonies have full voting status in the PIF. Why doesn't Guam have full voting status in the PIF? And it all kind of traces back to the fact that when Guam fought to get out from naval rule way back when, they put us under the Department of Interior. And that goes back to the insular cases, right? Because at the time, islanders were not fully the same as other people, right? So they stuck us in with the buffalo and the trees, and we were put into an agency, the Department of Interior, which everybody understands does not have the budget, the capability, the strength to be able to do any sort of advocacy for territories across the federal government. So one of the main things that is in my platform, and one of the main things that I want to do while we are pursuing this self-determination, is immediately start a process. And I've already talked to the 2 hopefuls in the CNMI, and we're going to discuss it more, but we've already started the discussion. Moving the territories from the Department of Interior into the Office of the President. Because if you do that, and we can do it now, we couldn't have done it 10, 15 years ago, but now that we are so fundamental to the national strategy of maintaining peace in the world, we have the ability to say, look, if we're the subject of discussion at the National Security Council, which is already in the White House, and we need to do all of this cross-cutting discussion, Interior's just not going to cut it. We need to move up to the office of the White House. And so we're going to have some discussions ongoing, but that is, I think, one of the first things that we could do. It could be started now. We would hopefully be able to accomplish at least some progress through a 2-year term if we pushed really hard and got buy-in from whoever sits in the White House. But that would be a first step to be able to get real discussions going where we got the attention of the White House to be able to address these issues.
Well, I mean, you won't get any argument from me about Interior being inferior. But I mean, it's. I think it's a very, obviously a very complex conversation because even we talked a little bit about not just the Interior, but the history with the insular cases and even our particular kind of colonial realities make for a very complex approach in how we kind of dissect these issues piece by piece without, if we're not going to just attack the core of it, which is why I've always said that self-determination, decolonization always has to be the priority. The insular, there's been a bunch of efforts to kind of attack and abolish the insular cases. And I don't think anybody's really against that. I mean, I'm not against it. Insular cases are clearly racist. Even the judiciary system, federal judiciary, is now saying, we're not going to, we're not going to acknowledge the insular cases anymore.
Right.
But I mean, I don't think it's that cut and dry, because we, like other non-self-governing territories, we have all made these historical attempts to kind of create this incremental change, right? To improve this kind of inferior status that we have now.
Right.
And that's something that we've seen done pretty successfully by places like the CNMI and American Samoa. And those are the two that come to mind when I think about, the efforts on kind of like a very laser focused insular cases attack, right? Is that if we just abolish the insular cases without, having this kind of bigger focus on self-determination and full self-government, then we in turn create an even more complicated situation.
It's a vacuum.
Yeah, because the CNMI, I mean, their land rights are built around the framework of the insular cases.
Exactly.
American Samoa's, traditional chief system or tribal leadership is built around that framework.
Right.
And so, when I think about what we're faced with and what, ultimately needs to happen with Guam, I agree that the interior is not the right place. The interior is clearly inferior, and we absolutely need out of there. But I mean, it's also, there's so many other things that come along with it. When I think about where Guam is at with our plebiscite, the biggest thing the most immediate thing we need to overcome is voter eligibility.
Right.
And, which I also think I have to say is counterintuitive. The challenge in the federal court system to our process, our proposed asserted process for decolonization, and the fact that we were ruled out, in a court system is, it's like Exhibit 178, of why we have this challenge and this fundamental disagreement between us and the federal government. Decolonization under the terms of the colonizer is not decolonization. Decolonization is the right of the colonized, not of the colonizer.
Right.
And yet we're over here like, oh well, yeah, we support Guam's decolonization, but only if you do it like this. Right. Only if you do it in a way that's that's cool with us. And I mean, we talked a little bit out in the hallway about the challenges for Guam, and I think it's wildly inappropriate that the federal government will come out and say, the Department of Defense specifically will come out and say, well, self-determination, that's not our area. We don't want to get involved with that. And rightfully so, they shouldn't.
Right.
But for them to say that and then refuse to acknowledge that they have an impact on self-determination, I just think it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous that we live in a day and age that it's like, oh, that is an acceptable answer. Oh, they just don't want to respectfully want to bow out, but inappropriately don't want to acknowledge the impact that they have on it. I mean, Guam is changing drastically every single day. You see it every day when you go out into the community. On a weekend, it looks different. We just got notice there's going to be like 5,000 to 6,000 people here for some ship that's docking.
Right.
The way that we have just accepted that this is just a part of our reality. Every so often, the ship is going to dock, and we're going to, the business people are going to make some extra money, and Tumon's going to be a little extra crowded. And it's just one of those things that we deal with, They're going to be training. You can't go and be out in the water in these areas on these days. It's just kind of an accepted part of our reality. How is that not an impact on our self-determination? When our population is set to increase by like 40,000 people, and the voter eligibility requirement for a self-determination plebiscite is a 1-year residency requirement, and the native people of Guam, who are only about like 47% of the total population right now, how is that not an impact on our self-determination? And yet, we're over here kind of dealing with the outcome of the Davis case at the Ninth Circuit Court, and being told that we can only run a self-determination plebiscite in a very specific way, and if not, then the government can't be involved. Now, the CNMI, obviously also has their own self-government issues. So does Puerto Rico. I think the difference between us and Puerto Rico is that they they have action on the congressional floor. You know, they put a bill forward to not just authorize a plebiscite, but to authorize a binding plebiscite,
Right.
which I think is huge. And granted, yeah, the bill has not passed the upper house. It passed the lower house, I believe is scheduled for a hearing in the Senate soon.
Yeah.
Who knows if that's actually going to pass or not?
Right.
But we've never even gotten anywhere close to that. You know, to have you know, a plebiscite authorized by Congress. I think the closest we've gotten is having Congress authorize the drafting of a constitution, which our people have rejected. And I just want to give props to our
Twice, right?
props to our leaders who, you know, who fought that
Yeah.
and kind of, you know, didn't drink the Kool-Aid on that one. Because, I mean, what kind of constitution are we writing if we haven't resolved our political status?
Right.
You know, a constitution as a territory is different than a state constitution, is different than a compact of free association, is different than, you know, an independent nation's constitution.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, and I'm glad you brought up Puerto Rico, because I think, and I'm actually very surprised that we don't do more collaboration with them, because I believe that their resident representative, Jennifer Colon, has done a really amazing job. Not only have they moved this bill forward for self-determination, they also got some major concessions, getting Jones Act relief that triggered several opportunities for economic opportunities in Puerto Rico, and they've done a lot more of that. And by the way, Puerto Rico also is my example of a territory moving out of interior and moving up to the White House,
Right.
because that's where they're at now. And look what happened. They moved out, they got up to the White House, they've been pushing, and all of a sudden they're getting that sort of broad support, right? And so the argument before used to be, well, that's because they have 3 million Puerto Ricos and their diaspora is even larger, and it's like, you know, a huge population in New York and all of these other places. Okay, that's fine, but look at Guam now. Guam is on the minds and the lips of literally everybody in the DoD sphere. You know, all of the committees that are talking about this competition with China, Guam is right there in the dialogue. And so I think what really needs to happen, and this is where I really look to the Commission on Self-Determination, I look to the leadership on Guam, there is an opportunity for us to pursue things that we really want to see happen. But you know why we're not doing that? Because who on Guam has put together the list? Who on Guam has actually sort of led that effort in Washington to say, the people of Guam want to see this? To me, in my mind, the last time that we did that, like we wanted to get the Medicare issue taken care of, which after many, many representatives was finally, you know, I think we can still, I mean, the Medicaid, we can lift the Medicaid caps, right? But when you're talking about the last major efforts, there was earned income tax credit, which went through several different representatives and we were able to get it. And then war reparations. And again, all of this started back with Antonio Wampat, and like it took sustained effort and vision. Guam saying, we want to see this, and then it was continued. No matter who got into that office, it was a vision for what Guam needed. And what I've seen in the last 6 years, you tell me one thing that is a goal of the people of Guam in Washington, D.C. There's nothing. It's like, you know, our representatives go to D.C. and they sort of look at the inbox and get familiar with, you know, where their office is going to be, and then just sort of handle the things as they come, which is, I think, precisely the reason that we lost the Compact Impact funding. They were acting surprised, like, oh, we lost it, even though we all knew it was going to expire after the 20-year period. So I think one of the things that we also need to look at, in addition to coming up with an actual roadmap for what we expect to happen in the Congress related to self-determination, right? We need to understand, what do we want the delegate to pursue? And then we also need to decide, what are the other things that we need from Washington, that the business community on Guam, the legislature on Guam, the administration on Guam, we need that list. And we need to then, as an island, sort of get together and push all in the same direction, working together with American Samoa, with CNMI, with Hawaii, get them on board, with Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands. I mean, Plasket's been really strong as well. And so we need to take that. But, you know, collaboration is one thing. What are we going to ask for? We don't even have that vision for what Guam wants to ask for from the Congress. And so the one thing that I hear is, right, so the Department of Defense is asking for all sorts of things, right? They're like, oh, we want this, we want that. And then to me, it's sort of sad, because the last couple of reps are like, oh, we brought all of, you know, $1.8 billion of funding for Guam. That wasn't for Guam.
Right.
That was for DOD.
Right.
DOD said we need 1.8 billion. Actually, they needed a lot more
Right.
than 1.8 billion dollars. They wrote it all up, and then the Guam delegate gets up, and I think supports your point. They're like reading this thing, going, "Okay, so Guam wants it isn't even what Guam wants. It's what DOD wants. We need a list of what Guam wants." And in my mind, there's a lot of things that are included in that list. Examples: we've got a port. We've been trying to get a new set of cranes at the port. We've got federal funding to be able to do it. For the life of us, we can't do it because there's a Buy America provision and this provision and that provision and some federal regulation that stops us, right? We're trying to expand agriculture. Half the time we can't expand agriculture because there's some vague USDA rule that says, no, you need to get your seeds from Texas instead of from the region, right? All of these things that we could chip away at that are holding back our economy, that are stopping us. Immigration, right? We are still not in control of our immigration. And now we don't even have, I mean, insult to injury, we don't even have compact impact anymore. This is the first year where we lost $15 million that we really needed for our schools and for our hospital. And so we need to, first and foremost, have somebody who goes to Washington and commits to working with the leadership on Guam, to having priorities that Guam wants to see happen in Washington, and then pursuing those for the people of Guam, and not just be lazy and let your buddies over at JRM hand you the list of the things DOD is going to do and go, oh, look, this is what we're doing in Congress and all this stuff is coming to Guam. Because unfortunately, the unintended consequence of that $1.8 billion that's coming to Guam is destabilizing the people of Guam. Right. This is why we have housing problems. Why wasn't that solved? All of that started back in 2019. And in 2019, our representative wasn't even sitting on armed services, right? So we didn't even have the visibility or the ability to say anything. We need to be at the table. We need to look at what's happening. We need to adjust those things. And I do not believe that the federal government has any ill will in terms of not wanting to fix these things. It's a question of we need to raise it. We need to suggest what the solutions are. And in the short term, start fixing the problems while at the same time absolutely pursuing self-determination. But I don't think you need one without the other. I think we need to do both at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's really there's nothing intelligent about kind of holding all of these immediate things hostage for the sake of self-determination. I just think that there's been kind of this inverse focus. We've kind of gotten so caught up in the low-lying fruit, like let me get a piece of this 1.8 billion, or let me try to carve out some infrastructure project out of the missile defense authorization or whatever. And I just think that it's it is just I feel like it has devalued Guam, what has been Guam's historical strength. In my opinion, Guam's historical strength is that decolonization and a full measure of self-government have always been nonpartisan issues, bipartisan issues. Right. Like, Guam is different than a lot of other non-self-governing territories that I've seen on the international circuit. You brought up the French colonies. French Polynesia is a perfect example. I've personally seen French Polynesia out at the UN, and it just depends on who's president in French Polynesia at the time. If the president is pro-France, then everything that France is doing for their self-determination, decolonization is fantastic. They're great partners. They're great collaborators. They want to have a deeper relationship. If the people in power are the Independence Party, then France is like the worst colonizer ever, and they're so oppressive, and the UN needs to intervene. And you just never know, which is different than Guam. Like, I've seen people who I think are conservative governors. I'll never forget when I saw Governor Calvo out there in I want to say it was 2017, when I was still a public school teacher. Governor Calvo went out there and delivered this really pointed testimony about, the militarization of Guam and the way that we have this extremely inequitable relationship. I've never been so proud of Governor Calvo in my life.
Yeah.
And I was so impressed.
Yeah. And
granted, that's not his usual rhetoric, and I get it. He was doing it because that's what was appropriate at that engagement on that stage. And bless his heart and his team for recognizing that was the moment
Yeah.
where you had to be strong and you had to kind of, hold the line. And, granted, Governor Cabo turned around and came back home and went right back to being best friends with the admiral,
Right.
and, having friendly relations with DOD. But at that level, at an international level, we were going to be very consistent about, this being our priority. And I feel like that's been one of our political weaknesses in terms of our leadership, is that we have refused to keep decolonization and self-government and self-determination tied to the militarization of the island. We know that that the militarization is gonna be ongoing. That the more that Guam becomes an important piece of the Indo-Pacific strategy, that the more attention Guam will get, the more resources will get dumped into Guam. And instead of us saying, like, kind of holding the line and saying this is gonna be the choke point, and this is what we're not gonna negotiate on. I feel like if Guam as a nation, if our leadership just kind of came together and just said, look, you can put anything you want on your military DOD wish list on what you want to see in Guam in terms of development and advancements and military technology, but and all of that's great, but we're not going anywhere until this is addressed. Instead, we're over here like, well, let's fix this road and let's get this water infrastructure going and let's figure out this sewer infrastructure and let's find out how to lease land for a hospital. And those are all great things. I'm not saying that they're not important things, but I just feel like those are things that we can also accomplish through a full measure of self-government. And the deeper that we get into this hole, the harder it becomes for us to self-govern. I had a good conversation with the deputy permanent representative of Timor-Leste, who was explaining to me that the history of Timor-Leste's independence is pretty similar to Guam, in the sense that Timor-Leste was also considered this very strategic location because it was the entry point to Indonesia.
Right.
And so there were a lot of, they didn't get the support for their decolonization from within the region, because a lot of nations within the region were just not willing to stand up to Indonesia or any of the other powers that be in their allies in that debate. And so they got their support from Africa and from Latin American nations. And I think that that's something that Guam just kind of has to recognize. And I know that it's always it's a slippery slope. People say that all the time. Well, do you really want to ally with Cuba and Venezuela? And is that the way that you're going to win Guam's decolonization? I don't necessarily think that that's what we're doing, but I do think that it's important to we can't continue to allow the political interests in the world to regularly supersede our desire for self-government. And I think that that's what we're seeing. Yes, we understand that there is a geopolitical conflict at play. Yes, we understand, where Guam fits into that conversation. But, I feel like that's just, feeding into the vicious cycle of that trap.
Well, let me pull back for a minute. And so the thing that really concerns me, right? So while I was off island, I when I came back about 5 years ago, it was more apparent to me, because when you leave for a period of time, you can really see the change. I think when you're here and the change sort of happens day to day, it's harder to see how much
Right.
it changed, right? And so when I came back, I was really struck by two things. Number one, the incredible renaissance of Chamorro culture. Like, absolutely incredible. It was a different Guam, right? The language had resurged, the culture had really sort of taken off. I mean, everybody now is wearing like traditional jewelry and, using Chamorro, and they're teaching it in the schools. And it's amazing, because that is something that I think had been taken away from all of those years under naval rule, and it really came back. But at the same time, I am seeing, and I hate to do this inside the outside the fence, right? I'm not trying to do that to divide people, but it is an effective way to discuss what's going on, right? And you look at what's happening outside the fence, right? I went to the meeting where they're talking about how we have to close schools. And the few schools that are, the schools that are not closing are covered with mold and broken down, and we don't have enough, resources to be able to put them together. You look at the hospital, also broken down. You look at the roads, right? My dad worked for Public Works, and when he was there, he was so proud. We had all the little dots, and the timing was good, and they're all well maintained. And now, I mean, we're sort of, even though we get the federal funding every now and again, and we've got some new ones coming in, we could do better, right? And you just sort of see, all the hits to tourism, all the hits from the typhoons, and it's like, why are we struggling to really come up with a diversified economy that can contribute in so many ways to a strong Indo-Pacific? Why don't we go back to having a thriving financial services economy? Why can't we leverage our undersea cables and our broadband to sort of raise up Guam? Let's just put aside the militarization. We are more than a military base. How many times have I written editorials, right, in the newspaper where I'm saying Guam is not just a gas station for the military, right? We are a gas station for the military in some sense. Yes, 30% of our island is being used for that. But what about the 70%? What are we doing, and what is inhibiting us from surging and not only having the societal and the environmental, but also the economic ability to raise up other opportunities that build Guam and don't just make us basically beholden to the fact that we have to wait for either a federal handout or some kind of military construction that we hope that we can get a piece of, right? And we need to really look at that and go back to the United States Congress and say Guam needs to be made whole in terms of policies that stop us from economic development, because economic development then leads to greater societal development, right?
Right.
When you have that economic development, you have larger budgets, you're able to provide better health care, better education to our people, and better job opportunities. Why are we not a research and development hub for ocean climate research and, all sorts of things that we could be doing as America and Asia? Why are we not a financial hub? Puerto Rico has turned into a financial hub for crypto, companies that are coming down from the East Coast. Why isn't Guam able to leverage our American territory status to be able to bring over financial capability from Asia Pacific and be able to create more high-paying jobs and keep our people on island? Reverse that brain drain and keep our best and brightest and entice back tomorrows who've left the island because they haven't found good opportunities here, and use that as, what do we want to do while we're pursuing this? And I find that there's been almost a change, and maybe I'll ask you why. Over the history, we've had periods where we've had leaders in Guam, especially in Washington, who have fought for really big changes, who got us the right to have a delegate, who got us U.S. citizenship. I mean, I can even remember when I was part of the Gutierrez administration, we fought for the North American Numbering Plan because it was ridiculous in the age of the internet that Guam children would have to pay $3 a minute for dial-up, and all the kids in the States would be able to just, access the internet. And we achieved that. And it seems like we haven't had that thinking anymore. And it's this whole thing where they say that the thing about colonialism is you have this feeling that things happen to you and you're not an agent for your own change. And when I look at the history of Guam, there were points in time where we did believe that we could be agents for change, where we did have a plebiscite, where we did look at the things that we wanted to do. And it seems like in the last 5 years, I don't know if it's COVID, I don't know if it's just a new generation, I don't know if people have just sort of given up, but it seems like so many people are not pushing anymore and don't have a vision anymore and are not aiming high anymore. And we're all just sort of accepting what's happening. And I think that we need to wake up and do more.
Well, I agree with that, and I got a really long response, but we're at the top of the hour. And I got to say, all of my listeners are not affected by this conundrum. I like to say that if you are not down with this idea that Guam can be self-governing, you simply lack imagination. And none of my listeners lack imagination. These guys are smart folks. That's why you tune into this show. But thanks for listening. Thanks for tuning in. We are at the top of the hour. We got to take a quick break for the news, but we will be here until noon. Ginger, you got time to stick around
Absolutely.
for the last hour? All right, so we'll be back with another hour of this conversation. You've been tuned in to Challenge the Status Quo on Wave 105.1 FM.
KGUM FM, Hagåtña, Guam. The sound of Guam is Wave 105 FM.
This is CBS News on the Hour, sponsored by